the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
Welcome back to The Faith Explained on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app. It's our series, Bogus or Biblical, the False Gospels and the Real Jesus. This is Cale Clark, and I'm joined once again by the author and editor of more than 90 books, hundreds of articles and reviews. He's taught all over the world, given lectures at Cambridge, Oxford, Durham, Yale, all over the place, the Field Museum in Chicago, and he's an expert on the historical Jesus, the New Testament, the Dead Sea Scrolls, archaeology. He's also my professor. The great Dr. Craig Evans is joining me. Dr. Evans, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Thank you, Cale. I'm great.
We're dealing with the false gospels. It's something called the Gospel of Judas. What happened on April the 6th, 2006, Dr. Evans?
My life got very complicated. Actually, on that day, the switchboard at Acadia Divinity College, where I was on the faculty, just about burned up. When I got back from Washington, D.C., after doing the press release for the Gospel of Judas, the switchboard operator, she said to me, "Where in the world have you been?" She says, "The phones have been blowing up." She hangs up, it rings again. She hangs up, it rings again. What happened was on that day, April 6th, as you just mentioned, there were 130 media people present in the auditorium at the National Geographic headquarters in Washington, D.C., and I was almost blinded. The lights from the cameras pointing at us, I think all I could see was green and blue for a couple of days. And we made our announcement that the Chacos Codex was discovered. It was discovered in the late 70s. It went missing. It got stuck in a deep freeze, which damaged it further. Anyway, it was finally came to light at the beginning of the new century after a couple of years of painstaking research, reassembly, translation, interpretation. It was announced to the world in April of '06 that this long-lost Gospel of Judas had been discovered. It's mentioned by the Church Father Irenaeus. He's highly critical of it, so we suspected it's the genuine thing. There is no doubt about it. It was originally written in Greek in the 2nd century, translated 150 years later into Coptic, and a copy of it survived in a Coptic Christian burial cave found in a stone box with a few other writings. And so it finally came to light. We were able to get it, put it back together. And then I think the whole thing got blown up because the reconstruction and translation were flawed, the interpretation dubious, and some people listening to us right now will remember this. 18 years ago, how it was presented as portraying Judas Iscariot, the infamous betrayer, was portrayed as the hero in the Gospel of Judas. And I and a few others were saying, I don't know if that's what it really says. I think we should be careful about it. After all, there are some pieces of pages missing. So a lot of us were calling it into question. That was controversial. And then guess what happened? A couple of missing pieces of pages were recovered, and it turned out we were right. Judas Iscariot is not a hero at all. He's considered the best of a bad lot. It's actually a savage criticism of the church. It's a mocking criticism. The church has got the gospel all wrong, and that the Spirit of Christ simply borrowed the body of Jesus for a little while, then returned into the glowing, luminous cloud, went back up to heaven, and Judas Iscariot ended up betraying Jesus and the man Jesus who's put to death. It's a typical Gnostic story. It's just a little bit unusual. Well, Irenaeus knew all about it. He described it. He criticized it. The text does agree with his description, so he did accurately talk about it. There was a lot of hype and exaggeration and distortion, I regret to say, 18 years ago. So eventually we did set the record straight. But what a deal that was.
Yeah, it's so strange. And I do want to read to you what St. Irenaeus actually said about this back in 180 AD. This is from his masterwork Against Heresies. He said, quote, "Others again declare that Cain derived his being from the power above and acknowledge that Esau, Korah, the Sodomites, and all such persons are related to themselves. On this account, they add, they have been assailed by the Creator, yet no one of them has suffered injury. For Sophia was in the habit of carrying off that which belonged to her from them to herself. They declare that Judas the traitor was thoroughly acquainted with these things, and that he alone, knowing the truth as no others did, accomplished the mystery of the betrayal. By him all things, both earthly and heavenly, were thus thrown into confusion. They produce a fictitious history of this kind, which they style the Gospel of Judas. End of quote. Is this the Cainite heresy, if you will, Dr. Evans?
I think so. And basically what it is, it says that every villain in the Old Testament is a good guy. Everybody who's portrayed as a villain, and that would include Cain, above all, the very first villain. And that's unfair. They're not really villains whatsoever. Neither was Judas, and blah, 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 blah. So it's a reverse reading of the Old Testament. And that fits into the general Gnostic understanding that there are two gods. There's the good God above, the God of light and truth. And then there's a false God, a wicked, evil, jealous, malevolent God who's much weaker. And he made the earth. And it's important for him to keep the earth corrupt, to keep captive among human beings these divine sparks that some human beings possess, others don't. And so these sparks are like the Duracell battery. It just keeps the bunny moving, and he doesn't want to lose them. If those sparks wake up and discover, oh my gosh, I'm from above, I'm trapped in this earthly, fleshly body below, I got to get out of here. And so Jesus then is a spark from above. He's the primal man, as it were. He comes down as Savior in disguise, fools all the evil beings that are allied to the bad God, and then finds and enlightens the disciples and others as to who he really is. Now, that's the typical Gnostic story. There are different versions of it. And so this Cainite group that I think Irenaeus has accurately described, they turn villains into heroes. And other Gnostic groups do that too. And so why are they villainized? Well, it's because the Jewish Bible, the Torah, the prophets and so on are written by Jews, and it's all corrupt, it's all bad. And so they call good guys bad guys, and they call bad guys good guys. They've got it upside down. And so the Gospel of Judas takes that perspective. And so Judas is the good guy. He's the one that understands the true mystery of the passion. And so he unwittingly, not because Jesus asked him, but he unwittingly fulfills the divine will by betraying Jesus so that his spirit can go back up to heaven, and the body, it doesn't matter what happens to it. So it's a goofy, strange story. Irenaeus talked about it before we finally found it, but we have a copy of it now. But what happened was modern scholars, the ones working on it 20 years ago, wanted to turn it into something it really wasn't. And that got a lot of headlines. Yeah. We were on the front page of 1,000 newspapers around the world. I mean, it was just astounding. And I was on the panel. We rehearsed and practiced and got ready to go for a year. And it was embarrassing because I think the text was misinterpreted. Now, Cale, I don't know if you know this, but Donald Sr., Father Donald Sr., who passed away not that long ago, who in his career was a great scholar of the Gospel of Matthew, he was on the panel with me, and we were allies. It was like, well, we're the two voices of reason. And I remember Father Senior was asked, do you think the church is going to have to change its teaching now that this has been published? And he looked right at the camera and he goes, no. I thought, good for you. Yeah, good answer. So we were allies against a phalanx of strange ideas.
No, absolutely. I want you to comment on that in just a second. But yeah, the late Father Donald Sr., may he rest in peace. This is truly an absolutely bizarre take on Judas. For example, here's a quote from the Gospel of Judas. Judas standing before Jesus saying, I know who you are and from where you have come. You are from the immortal realm of Barbelo. I don't know if that's where Barbie is from, or Barbelo. I've never heard of this place. And I am not worthy to utter the name of the one who has sent you. And then after this, Jesus teaches Judas privately. Okay, this guy's a great student. Let's give him some more instruction here. This is, again, a Gnostic tendency, being this idea of secret knowledge coming out, isn't it?
Yes, and secret knowledge being disclosed to marginal disciples. You have these Gospels like Gospel of Mary, or Gospel of Philip, or Gospel of Thomas. And the reason for that is these are people who were not especially prominent. Now, in real life, in history, who knows? But in the later stories that are told, the later traditions that are passed on, they don't figure prominently. And so, Peter figures prominently. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, figure prominently. Matthew becomes famous for, as the author of the Gospel of Matthew. John, of course, hugely famous because of the Gospel of John. So what you want to do, if you're a Gnostic, if you're a heretic, if you want to change the Jesus story, you can't appeal to Matthew, or, that's not going to work. You have to appeal to some other relatively unknown figure. And so that's how you get away with it. So you say, well, hey, have you ever heard of the Gospel that Philip wrote, or the Gospel that Mary wrote? Well, no, I missed that one. And well, I've got a copy of it. And so that's how you smuggle into the conversation, as it were, some very new and strange ideas. And so, like, Cale, you're there and you say, okay, I've never heard that before. Did Jesus really say it? Well, yes, he said it, but he didn't say it publicly. That's why you don't know about it. He spoke this secretly. He took Judas aside, or Mary, or Philip, or somebody. He took them aside and whispered in their ear, and only they heard it. Yeah, so that's the whole idea. That's kind of it's a game almost.
Yeah, and if you join our little group, we'll let you in on the secret. You don't want to be part of the universal Catholic Church with public revelation that everybody can know about. You need the real inside scoop. Yeah, and that's how some of these cults and groups get started, obviously. But even in the modern world, Dr. Evans, and you mentioned even the blinding lights of the press conference for the announcement of the Gospel of Judas publication, what is it about this stuff that you think grabs modern men and women and makes them interested in a way that the canonical Gospels of the New Testament do not?
Boy, that's an interesting question, and I imagine there are several answers to it. In the scholarly world, there's pressure, of course, to discover new things. You don't just want to keep publishing the same old. And I think the same is true in the popular world. And, of course, newspaper people, media people, they call it news for a reason. It's new. And so you'll never see a headline that says, gospel story turns out to be correct after all. That's never going to be a headline. The traditional answer is right after all. You'll never see that. So what's going to be a headline is something shocking, challenging, that's going to suggest that the church has it wrong, that the canonical Gospels are not the right ones, that other Gospels should have been in the Bible. That's the kind of stuff you're going to hear in popular media. So I think that's the general backdrop, and that's why when something curious comes along, like that really embarrassing fiasco a few years ago, the so-called Gospel of Jesus' wife that hoodwinked a distinguished professor at Harvard. The reason things like that happen is because there's this eagerness and this openness among scholars as well as among the general public to hear something new. And if it happens to embarrass the church, if it casts, a cloud over the Vatican or the Pope or something like that, that's even better. And so I think there is this thing out there, and scholars unfortunately fall for it. And so mistakes were made in the Gospel of Judas, how to interpret it correctly. I think the record has been set straight now, but of course the media is not interested now that we got it right. And of course, in the case of the Gospel of Jesus' wife, what a fiasco, what an embarrassment for Harvard. So, this isn't the last of it, Cale. Next year or the year after, we'll be talking about something else that's come to light and that's just as goofy.
This entire episode of The Faith Explained is on the Relevant Radio app. The Relevant Radio app is completely free and updated daily with fresh articles, podcasts, and prayers. Don't delay. Download the app today, and thanks for listening.